New Year's Eve feels safe for a reason. Lights are on, streets are full, people are everywhere. But the crimes you're about to hear didn't happen in the dark. They happened in public, quietly, while people were close enough to help, but too distracted to notice. Tonight, you're going to hear 3 stories, and in every one of them, the most disturbing part isn't what someone did. It's how long it took for anyone to realize a crime was happening at all.
New Year's Eve looks different through a child's eyes. For adults, it's noise, lights, time. For kids, it's confusion. Too many people, too many voices, rules that suddenly change for one night. The city hosted a family countdown, an early one, 9 o'clock fireworks, music kept low, extra lighting, police officers visible but relaxed. Parents liked it because it felt controlled. That word matters, controlled. Because this story exists because people believed they were in control. The child was 6, small enough to disappear in a crowd, old enough to trust instructions. They wore a winter jacket that was too big. The sleeves covered their hands. That detail appears in every report because it's the last thing anyone remembers clearly. The countdown started. Parents crouched down, smiling, explaining numbers. Kids shouted without understanding why. 10, 9, 8. Phones went up. That's when attention leaves the ground. Crowds don't move suddenly, they shift. A stroller stops, someone bends down, people step sideways without thinking. That's all it takes. The child didn't scream. That's important, because screams bring help. Confusion does not.
Witnesses later described seeing the child walking, holding a hand, calm, not being dragged, not resisting. That's why no one reacted. They assumed it was a parent, or an older sibling, or someone who belonged. Predators understand that assumption. They don't rush. They match the pace of the crowd. Urgency attracts attention. Confidence dissolves it. The countdown ended. Fireworks went off. Adults cheered. Kids covered their ears. Parents hugged. For a few seconds, nothing else existed. When the noise faded, reality tried to return. At first, there was no panic, just a parent turning slowly, scanning faces, calling a name quietly, because yelling feels embarrassing, because no one wants to overreact. Bathrooms were checked, food trucks, the last place they stood. Hope delays urgency. Every parent does this. They search before they scream. Security was notified, but not immediately, because parents believe they've missed something. They blame themselves first. By the time exits were monitored, the crowd had already thinned. Families were leaving. Cars filled the streets. Normal resumed. And normal hides things. Cameras caught pieces, not everything. The child walking, looking back once, not scared, just confused. That image broke investigators later because it meant trust had been used, not force. Whoever took the child knew where cameras were, knew where crowds thinned, knew how parents behave when surrounded by other parents. That knowledge doesn't come from impulse. It comes from observation. New Year creates opportunity, not because people are careless, but because they're focused on memory making. And predators understand that better than anyone. By the time panic replaced hope, the fireworks debris was already being cleaned. Stages were coming down. The night was erasing itself. This story doesn't begin when the child disappears. It begins with the moment everyone assumes someone else is watching.
The first question everyone asks is always the same. How long? How long before someone noticed? How long before security was alerted? How long before police arrived? But the truth is harder. There is no single moment where panic begins. It creeps in. At first, it still felt fixable. A parent wooing faster now, calling the name louder, asking strangers politely, "Have you seen a child in a blue jacket?" Most people shook their heads without stopping. Not because they didn't care, because the crowd was already thinning. Everyone was transitioning back to real life. Security was finally notified. Radios crackled. 2 guards split directions. Procedures began. But procedures move at human speed, and time doesn't wait. The phrase "missing child" wasn't used immediately. Not out loud, because saying it makes it real. Police arrived quickly. That detail matters. No one ignored this, but speed doesn't erase distance. Exits had already emptied. Cars had already merged into traffic. Officers asked the same questions. What were they wearing? Height? Any distinguishing marks? Answers came out uneven, because panic fractures memory. One parent couldn't stop apologizing, over and over, as if responsibility could be negotiated. Cameras were pooled. Not one, many. Different angles, different resolutions, different blind spots. The footage didn't show violence. That made it worse. They saw the child walking, holding a hand, calm, matching the crowd's pace. That image stalled urgency for just a moment, because it looked safe. But then the footage diverged. One camera lost the pair behind a food truck. Another picked them up near a temporary barrier. Then nothing. Just movement. Swallowing movement.
Officers locked down what they could, but New Year's crowds don't exist in neat lines. They spill. And spilled crowds don't rewind. The parents waited. Standing. Then sitting. Then standing again. Phones rang. Friends arrived. Then family. Time blurred. This is when guilt gets loud. Not logical guilt. Emotional guilt. The kind that rewrites memory. Why didn't I hold tighter? Why did I look at my phone? Why did I trust the crowd? Police didn't accuse. They reassured. But reassurance doesn't quiet the mind. As hours passed, the city reset. Street cleaners finished. Barricades came down. Traffic patterns normalized. The night officially ended. But the search didn't. Search grids expanded. Photos were circulated. Tips came in. Most were nothing. Some were cruel. People mean well, but chaos attracts noise. One detail haunted investigators. No one remembered a face clearly. They remembered posture, movement, confidence. That's the hardest part to explain. Crimes involving children are expected to be frantic, messy, desperate. This wasn't. The person who took the child didn't behave like someone stealing. They behaved like someone returning something. And that distinction changed everything. By dawn, hope was still alive, but it had changed shape. It wasn't, "We'll find them." It was, "Please let this still be simple." New Year's morning arrived quietly. People slept in. Phones buzzed with resolutions. And somewhere between notifications, a family learned how loud silence can be. There was no single clue that explained everything. No dramatic breakthrough. Just a pattern that became clearer the longer investigators stared at it. The person who took the child didn't rely on speed. They relied on permission. Permission created by routine, by politeness, by the belief that adults around children are supposed to be trusted. New Year family events are designed to feel safe. That's why predators study them. They know where parents relax. They know when attention drifts. They know how authority is assumed. A confident voice, a calm pace, a simple gesture. that's often enough. Investigators later identified the method. Not a trick, not a lie, a role. Witnesses described the same posture, the same body language. Someone who looked like they belonged there, like a helper, like staff, like family. That's the cruelty. The crime didn't break rules, it used them. The child wasn't taken to a hidden place. They were taken through normal space, walkways, parking lots, areas designed for flow. Normal movement never triggers alarms. Search teams expanded outward, canvassed neighborhoods, reviewed traffic footage. But New Year's traffic doesn't move cleanly, it scatters, and scattered moments don't line up again. Days passed, then weeks. The city remembered the story briefly, then moved on. That's what cities do. For the family, time stopped behaving normally. Every sound felt like a signal. Every call felt final. They learned a new way to exist, one built entirely around waiting. Authorities never released every detail, not to protect the investigation, but to protect the public. Because this crime didn't involve force, it involved access, and access is harder to take away. There was no clean ending, no announcement that made the pain smaller, just a quiet understanding among those involved. The moment mattered more than the aftermath. New Year returned, fireworks again, crowds again, family events again. Parents held hands tighter, not because they were careless before, but because they now understood something. This story isn't about a missing child. It's about how easily trust can be redirected, how quickly attention can shift, how silence can be mistaken for safety. Crimes like this don't need darkness, they need belief. Belief that help looks familiar. Belief that danger looks obvious. Belief that someone else is watching. And the most painful truth of all, everyone in that crowd did exactly what they were supposed to do. They celebrated. They trusted. They looked away for a moment. December 31st, just a few minutes before midnight. The fireworks were already going off. Not the official ones people wait for, the random ones, the impatient ones, the kind that explode without warning and make loud noises feel normal. Phones were in people's hands. Some were recording the sky. Some were counting out loud. 9, 8, 7. In Ashford Vale, nothing felt dangerous that night. And that's the first problem. Because danger doesn't arrive when people are scared. It arrives when people are relaxed. Street lights were on. Music leaked out of bars. Crowds moved confidently like they belonged there. People weren't watching each other. They were assuming. Assuming noise meant celebration. Assuming fast movement meant urgency. Assuming calm voices meant safety. And most dangerously, assuming that if something was wrong, someone else would notice. That assumption is the foundation of this story. Earlier that evening, Ashford Vale looked exactly how Americans like their cities to look on holidays. Busy, bright, predictable. Downtown was packed for the River Light Countdown, a city event with food trucks, temporary stages, and barricades placed just far enough apart to feel organized. Families came early and left early. Couples lingered. College students filled bars as the night went on. Police cars were visible, not in an aggressive way, in a reassuring way, the kind of presence that makes people feel protected without actually paying attention to what's happening around them. Emergency lines were already busy, not with serious crimes, with distractions. Noise complaints, minor crashes, firework burns, lost phones, people who drank a little too much and needed help getting home. The system wasn't broken, it was occupied. and occupied systems miss quiet things. A few blocks away, inside a rented townhouse, a small New Year's gathering was winding down early for two people. They weren't arguing, they weren't drunk, they weren't scared, they were tired. They had both said the same thing earlier in the night. "I don't want to be out after midnight." That sentence appears in more real police reports than people realize. Leaving early feels responsible. It feels like avoiding risk. They weren't running from danger. They were trying to do everything right. 11:48 p.m. They zipped their jackets and stepped outside. Cold air hit immediately, sharp enough to make breathing feel louder. Fireworks echoed between buildings, distorting distance and direction. At that moment, nothing had gone wrong. No warning signs, no bad feeling, no reason to hesitate. Ride-share apps were already lagging. Public transit alerts showed delays. Phones buzzed with countdown notifications. So they did what most people would do. They walked, not away from people, toward them, toward Juniper Row, a brightly lit corridor near a transit walkway. Cameras overhead, lights on, people moving in and out. It felt like a safe place to stop and think. That feeling mattered, because comfort doesn't just relax you, it disarms you.
12 a.m. Midnight changed the city. Phones lit up everywhere. Heads went down. Eyes left the street. People screamed. People hugged. People filmed fireworks instead of faces. This is the moment psychologists warn about. When everyone is present, no one feels responsible. It's called diffused responsibility. Waiting became the problem. Cold forced decisions. Low batteries forced movement. They stayed near Juniper Row, trying to figure out the next step. At this point, nothing illegal had happened. That's what made it dangerous, because crimes like this don't announce themselves. They blend in. Here's something most people don't like admitting. Your brain doesn't protect you by making you afraid. It protects you by making things feel normal. It asks quiet questions. Am I misunderstanding this? Is this just how things are tonight? Do they know each other? Do I want to be wrong in public? Those thoughts don't feel threatening. They feel polite. And politeness is easy to manipulate.
This is the part of the night where people stop trusting their instincts and start trusting the environment. Bright lights, crowds, noise. Everything tells you you're safe. And when everything tells you you're safe, you stop looking for danger. This is where the story actually begins. Not with violence, not with fear, but with the moment people stop paying attention. For a few seconds after that moment, nothing changed. No screams, no running, no sudden shift in the crowd. That's the part people misunderstand. They expect danger to announce itself. It doesn't. It waits for normal to do the work for it. The noise around Juniper Row never stopped. Fireworks cracked overhead. Car horns layered into the sound. Music leaked out of nearby bars. So when voices blended together, no one noticed, because nothing sounded wrong. People passed by without slowing down, not because they didn't care, because nothing looked urgent. That's how crimes like this survive. They don't hide in darkness. They hide in routine. 12:04 a.m. They were still standing near the entrance, close enough to the crowd to feel protected, far enough to feel out of the way. Phones were checked again. Batteries lower now. Signal inconsistent. Small frustrations stacking quietly. That's when the third person stepped closer. Not suddenly, not aggressively, naturally. Like someone joining a conversation that was already happening. Witnesses later struggled to describe this moment. Not because they didn't see it, but because nothing about it stood out. The posture was relaxed, the tone was calm, the distance was respectful. Everything about it suggested familiarity, and familiarity is powerful. Here's something psychologists talk about, but most people never notice. When someone speaks calmly in a public place, our brains assume they have a reason to be there. Authority doesn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes it just sounds confident. The conversation was brief, not rushed, not tense, just long enough to feel legitimate. No one nearby heard the words clearly. Fireworks swallowed the sound, but body language told a convincing story. Heads nodding, small gestures, movement that looked coordinated. From the outside, it looked like a decision being made together. That's important, because intervention requires disagreement, and disagreement wasn't visible. 12:06 a.m. They shifted position slightly, closer to the edge of Juniper Row, still under lights, still within view of cameras, still surrounded by people. Nothing about this movement triggered concern, because people move all the time, especially on nights like this, especially when plans are changing. This is the moment where fear usually saves people. But fear didn't arrive. Confusion did. And confusion is quiet. It doesn't tell you to run. It tells you to wait, to listen, to avoid making a mistake in public. Think about how often you've done that. Stayed silent because you weren't sure, didn't interrupt because you might be wrong, assumed someone else understood the situation better than you did. That instinct isn't weakness, it's conditioning, and it can be exploited. 12:09 a.m. Last clear frame. Security footage later showed them together, standing close enough to talk, far enough apart to look casual. This is the last moment anyone can confirm. After this, the camera angle changes. Crowds block the view. Movement overlaps, and the story stops looking clear. Not because something dramatic happened, but because clarity quietly disappeared. What happened next didn't involve force. No grabbing, no shouting, no visible resistance. Investigators would later use a specific term for this kind of crime: compliance-based control. It relies on timing, on tone, on the hesitation people feel when they don't want to cause a scene, especially in public, especially on holidays, especially when everything around them looks normal. From a distance, nothing illegal appeared to be happening. That's why no one stepped in, because stepping in requires certainty, and certainty never arrived. The crowd kept moving, fireworks kept exploding, midnight celebrations spilled into early morning routines, and somewhere in that noise, a line was crossed, without anyone realizing it had happened. By the time doubt began to surface, the moment to stop it cleanly was already gone. By the time they stepped away from the brightest part of Juniper Row, nothing about the situation felt urgent. That's the detail investigators kept returning to. Not that it happened fast, not that it happened violently, but that it happened calmly. Calm enough to feel intentional, calm enough to feel authorized, calm enough that no one nearby felt the need to interrupt. The third person didn't rush them. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't block the way. They stood at an angle that suggested choice. That angle matters. It communicates safety without saying it out loud. People misunderstand control. They think it looks aggressive. But the most effective control looks cooperative. It sounds reasonable. It uses words like just, real quick, and over here. It avoids commands, because commands trigger resistance. Suggestions do not. Witnesses later described a moment where the group paused, not stopped, paused, as if confirming something, as if waiting for agreement that never needed to be spoken. From a distance, it looked like planning.
From nearby, it sounded like logistics. No one saw fear, because fear doesn't always show up first. Sometimes it hides behind politeness. This is the part people don't like hearing. The crime didn't begin with force. It began with permission. Not permission that was given, permission that was assumed. A small shift happened next. They moved just far enough to break the line of sight with the main walkway. Still lit, still public, but no longer centered. Crowds thinned slightly here. Not empty, just distracted. People passed by, close enough to notice movement, not close enough to question it.
Here's where the psychology turns dark. When something happens in public, we assume it's been approved. Approved by security, approved by the crowd, approved by someone paying attention. That assumption replaces judgment, and judgment is what stops crimes. Voices stayed low. The third person's posture remained relaxed. No urgency, no pressure. Pressure creates witnesses. Calm creates compliance. Investigators would later call this situational dominance, the ability to control a moment without controlling a person. No threats, no visible coercion, just a sequence of small decisions that slowly removed alternatives. At some point, a choice disappeared. Not abruptly, quietly. That's the cruel part. There was no moment where someone could say, "This is where it went wrong," because nothing felt wrong yet. Security footage loses clarity here. Angles overlap. Bodies block views. Light reflects off movement. The camera didn't fail. It just kept recording a crowd. And crowds hide things. Later analysis focused on timing, how long it took, how little time it actually required. From first contact to the point where intervention would have mattered, only minutes passed. Minutes no one noticed because nothing demanded attention. This is where most people ask the same question: why didn't anyone stop it? And the answer is always uncomfortable, because stopping it would have required someone to be wrong, wrong in public, wrong loudly. People don't like that. By the time the situation finally shifted, by the time doubt became concern, the structure of the moment had already changed. Paths closed, options narrowed. Normal had already done its job. What followed didn't look dramatic. No chase, no screams, no sudden chaos. Just absence. And absence is hard to notice when the night is still loud. When investigators later reconstructed the timeline, they found something disturbing. There was no single action that clearly crossed a line, no obvious red flag. Just a series of moments where no one felt certain enough to intervene. That's what makes this a crime. Not violence, not speed, but how completely it relied on people doing exactly what they're taught to do. Stay calm, be polite, don't assume the worst. By the time the crowd shifted again, the opportunity to stop what was happening had already passed. Cleanly, quietly, without leaving a scene. Morning didn't arrive the way people expected to. No sudden silence, no clean reset, just exhaustion. Juniper Row looked normal again. Street cleaners moved through slowly. Broken bottles were swept aside. Leftover confetti stuck to wet pavement. The night erased itself piece by piece. That's how cities work. At first, no one reported anything unusual because no one knew what to report. There had been no screams, no visible fight, no obvious emergency, just people going home. Phones were checked, messages sent, then sent again. Calls went unanswered. That still wasn't enough to trigger panic, because unanswered messages happen, especially after nights like this.
especially when people assume someone is asleep or hungover or charging their phone somewhere. The first feeling wasn't fear, it was irritation, then confusion. Fear comes later. Fear needs confirmation. By late morning, concern started to surface, not dramatically, quietly, in fragments. One person realized something was off, then another. Stories didn't line up anymore. Who left with whom? Who said what? Who was supposed to check in? Everyone remembered the night differently. That's another cruel detail. Crowds don't produce clean memories. They produce fragments. The assumption everyone relied on, that someone else knew what was happening, started to crack. And when it cracked, it didn't break loudly. It collapsed inward. By the time authorities became involved, the timeline was already fragile. Hours had passed. Foot traffic erased tracks. Weather softened details. Digital noise buried clarity. Nothing was missing, except certainty. Investigators reviewed footage. Not just one camera, dozens. Angles stitched together. Moments replayed at reduced speed. They weren't looking for violence. They were looking for deviation, something out of place, something that didn't belong. And that was the problem. Nothing stood out enough. Every frame showed movement, people talking, walking, pausing. Nothing that screamed danger, nothing that demanded intervention, just normal behavior. That's what made the review unbearable, because the crime didn't hide, it blended. Statements were collected. Everyone agreed on one thing. Nothing felt wrong at the time. And that sentence appeared again and again. It didn't seem strange. It looked normal. I thought they knew each other. Normal became the alibi. As the hours turned into a full day, a different kind of silence set in. The kind that follows when optimism runs out, when excuses stop working, when people realize they may have witnessed something irreversible without knowing it. This is where guilt enters the story. Not criminal guilt, human guilt. The kind that asks questions with no answers. Should I have looked longer? Should I have said something? Why didn't I trust that feeling? But hindsight is cruel. It shows you clarity only after clarity would have mattered. The case didn't explode into headlines. There was no dramatic press conference, no urgent warning issued that night. Because urgency requires evidence, and evidence requires disruption. This crime avoided disruption entirely. By the time the absence could no longer be explained away, the moment to stop it had passed cleanly. No broken scene, no clear turning point, just a gap where normal used to be.
There was no clean ending to this case. No dramatic arrest. No moment where everything made sense. Just a slow realization that something had gone wrong in a way that couldn't be undone. Investigators eventually reached a conclusion, not about who did it, but about how it happened. And that distinction matters, because this wasn't a crime driven by rage. It wasn't impulsive. It was patient. The timeline suggested preparation, not in the obvious sense, no weapons, no violent planning, but an understanding of people, of crowds, of hesitation, of how much pressure silence can hold. Experts later described it as a crime that borrowed safety, borrowed it from the lights, from the noise, from the assumption that danger looks dangerous, and then returned nothing. There was no single failure. That's the part people struggle with. No broken rule, no ignored alarm. Just a system that worked exactly as designed. People trusted the environment, and the environment did nothing to protect them. As weeks passed, the city moved on, because cities always do. New crowds filled Juniper Row, new nights replaced old ones, new assumptions formed. That's how normal survives. But for the people closest to what happened,
Normal never came back. They replayed the same moments, the pause, the shift, the calm.
trying to find a point where a different choice could have changed the outcome. They never found one that felt solid. And that's the most disturbing part. This story doesn't end with a warning. It ends with a question. How many times have you been in a crowd and assumed someone else was paying attention? How many times have you seen something slightly off and decided it wasn't your place to interrupt? How many moments have passed because nothing demanded urgency? This crime didn't rely on darkness. It relied on permission. Permission created by politeness, by doubt, by the fear of being wrong in public. That assumption that if something were wrong, it would look wrong, is the foundation of this story, and it's still holding. Because somewhere tonight, under bright lights, surrounded by noise and celebration, someone will stop looking for danger, not because they're careless, but because everything tells them they're safe.
New Year's Eve didn't end loudly in this neighborhood. It faded. Fireworks stopped before midnight. Music cut out early. Lights went dark one house at a time. That's what made it noticeable. Because on New Year's, quiet is unusual. The street still had decorations up. Plastic reindeer, faded lights wrapped around trees, a few wreaths left hanging out of habit. But people were already done celebrating. They were tired, cold, ready to reset. That's when the house stood out. It wasn't abandoned, and it wasn't celebrating. It was active. I noticed it just after midnight, not because of noise, because of control. Every other house went dark in stages, living room first, then bedrooms. This one didn't. Every light stayed on, not bright, dimmed, as if someone wanted visibility without attention. The curtains were closed, all of them, not loosely, carefully. Each window sealed off the same way. That detail matters, because care takes time. People assume crimes on New Year's are loud. Drunk fights, gunshots, sirens. But that's not the kind that lasts. The ones that last don't need chaos. They need distraction. And New Year's provides plenty of it. The car arrived just after 12:20 a.m. Slow, too slow. Lights off before it stopped moving. That pause, engine still running, lights dark, felt intentional, like someone waiting to be sure no one was watching.
The door opened quietly. No slam, no hurry, just enough movement to confirm someone had entered. Then, nothing. At first, I'd told myself this was normal. People work late, people host private parties, people don't owe their neighbors explanations. That's how discomfort survives. We explain it away. But patterns don't need explanations. They need repetition, and repetition came quickly. Every night after New Year, the same lights, the same timing, always after midnight, never before. No one ever saw guests arrive together. People came alone, always alone, and they never stayed long. 15 minutes, 20 at most. Enough time to go inside, not enough time to socialize. No laughter, no music, no signs of celebration. Just arrivals and departures. Here's the part that still makes my chest tighten. No one ever saw anyone leave with someone else, but the number of visitors never matched the number of exits. I started paying attention to small things. Trash bags, not on schedule, always heavy, always taken out late, never left at the curb overnight, as if someone didn't want them seen in daylight. Dogs on the street started reacting. Not barking, freezing, refusing to walk past that driveway. Animals don't understand New Year's. They don't understand excuses. They react to what feels wrong.
One night, the 5th night after New Year, I heard something. Not screaming, not crying. A low sound, muffled, like a voice pressed into fabric. It stopped. Quickly, too quickly. Just long enough to question myself. I waited. Lights stayed on. Shadows moved behind curtains. Normal resumed. That's the cruel part. Fear that disappears makes you doubt it was ever real. The next morning I checked reports. Nothing. No calls logged, no disturbances. The system had noticed nothing, which meant, officially, nothing had happened. That's when it hit me. Whatever was happening in that house didn't rely on force. It relied on compliance, on people walking inside willingly, on routines that looked harmless, on the assumption that if something were wrong on New Year's, someone would have noticed. I stopped telling myself I was overthinking, because overthinking doesn't explain missing exits. New Year's is supposed to be about new beginnings, but in that house, something was being repeated, carefully, quietly, and whatever it wasn't meant to end. After New Year's, routines are supposed to return. People go back to work. Lights turn off earlier. Streets quiet down. That's when patterns become visible. And this one was impossible to ignore. People kept arriving at the house. Not every night, but often enough that it stopped feeling random. Always alone, always after midnight, never together. They didn't look like party guests. No laughter, no bags, no obvious reason to be there. Most of them parked a short distance away, not directly in front. That detail matters. People who expect to be seen don't do that. They'd walk up calmly, not hesitant, not rushed, like they'd been there before, like they knew exactly where they were going. The door would open almost immediately. No waiting, no knocking twice, as if someone inside was already watching, already prepared. And then, nothing. No sound, no movement, just the lights staying on. 15 minutes later, sometimes less, the front door would open again. Someone would leave, alone, the same way they arrived. After New Year's, routines are supposed to return. People go back to work. Lights turn off earlier. Streets quiet down. That's when patterns become visible. And this one was impossible to ignore. People kept arriving at the house. Not every night, but often enough that it stopped feeling random. Always alone, always after midnight, never together. They didn't look like party guests. No laughter, no bags, no obvious reason to be there. Most of them parked a short distance away, not directly in front. That detail matters. People who expect to be seen don't do that. They'd walk up calmly, not hesitant, not rushed, like they'd been there before, like they knew exactly where they were going. The door would open almost immediately. No waiting, no knocking twice, as if someone inside was already watching, already prepared. And then, nothing. No sound, no movement, just the lights staying on. 15 minutes later, sometimes less, the front door would open again. Someone would leave, alone, the same way they arrived. Here's what started to feel wrong. The faces. People came in looking tense, jaw tight, shoulders raised. But the ones who left looked different. Not relieved, not calm. Flattened, like something had been removed. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others stared straight ahead, as if they didn't want to see anything else. One person stood on the sidewalk for nearly a minute before walking away.
Not on the phone, not waiting, just standing there, breathing. That was the first time I thought, this isn't social, it's transactional. New Year's does something strange to people. It lowers resistance. Everyone is already in a mindset of change, of reset, of maybe this is the year. That makes people easier to guide, easier to convince. I started noticing differences. Some visitors never came back. Others did, more than once. Those ones stayed longer. Their visits stretched from minutes to half an hour, sometimes more. The longer visits worried me the most because they didn't end the same way. One night, close to 1:30 a.m., someone left the house shaking, not visibly injured, but unsteady, like their body needed time to remember how to move. They didn't walk straight. They didn't look around. They just went. The house didn't react. Lights stayed on, curtains stayed closed. It didn't adjust because whatever was happening inside was working.
I tried to rationalize it. Support group, therapy sessions, some kind of private service, but none of those explanations matched the timing or the secrecy or the silence, and none of them explained this. People entered voluntarily, but they didn't leave the same way. I started checking missing person notices, not obsessively, casually, just enough to confirm something I didn't want to believe. Nothing obvious matched. That should have been comforting. It wasn't, because crimes don't always remove people immediately. Some remove pieces, confidence, stability, agency. Those losses don't get reported. Here's what finally convinced me this was more than discomfort. One night, I watched someone arrive, a young adult, hood up, hands in pockets. They hesitated at the door just for a second. That hesitation mattered because it meant doubt had arrived. The door opened anyway, from the inside, before they knocked. They went in, and the door closed. 20 minutes later, someone else left. Not the same person, different jacket, different build. I'm certain of that. No one else arrived. No one else left. Just one person in, a different person out. I replayed that moment for weeks, trying to explain it, trying to tell myself I was mistaken, that lighting had fooled me, that angles lie. But here's the truth. Your brain knows when something doesn't add up. You just don't want to accept it. Whatever was happening in that house wasn't just exploiting silence. It was exploiting trust. Trust in routines, trust in privacy, trust in the idea that crimes are obvious. And the most disturbing part, every single person who walked in did so willingly, because nothing about the situation looked illegal. That's when I realized this wasn't about hiding crime. It was about designing it so no one would question it. By the time I understood that, New Year's felt very far away, but the damage from it was still unfolding.
By the second week after New Year's, I stopped asking if something was wrong. I started asking how long it had been going on. What finally made things clear wasn't the sound. It was paperwork. A flyer appeared on a community board near the grocery store. Not flashy, not dramatic, just text. A few tear-off tabs at the bottom. It promised help, private sessions, confidential support, no records, no insurance. Reset for the new year. That phrase hit harder than it should have. The contact number led to a burner phone. I know because it changed frequently. The address listed wasn't exact, just a block range, close enough to find, vague enough to deny. That's when the shape of the crime finally appeared. It wasn't random, it was curated. People weren't showing up accidentally. They were being invited, quietly. Online posts, private messages, New Year forums full of people talking about change, about regret, about wanting to disappear for a bit. The house wasn't hosting parties, it was hosting access. Here's the part that still feels uncomfortable to say out loud. No one was dragged inside. No one was forced. They were guided. New Year is when people feel weakest. They take inventory of their lives. They list failures. They look for shortcuts to relief. And someone understood that perfectly. Inside the house, the environment did the work. Low light, controlled sound, no clocks. Time dissolves in places like that. And when time dissolves, people stop tracking decisions. The sessions were structured, not chaotic. That's important. Chaos creates witnesses. Structure creates deniability. People entered expecting help. They left having signed away something else. Consent forms written vaguely enough to mean nothing and everything. Waivers that didn't explain consequences, just responsibility. The cruelty wasn't physical. It was systematic. Isolation. Pressure framed as care. Compliance reframed as growth. People were encouraged to let go of boundaries, of resistance, of the idea that they could just leave. This wasn't a crime built on pain. It was built on erasure. That's why exits didn't always match entries. Some people stayed longer. Some never came back at all. Not because they were gone, but because they no longer recognized themselves as missing. The house didn't need violence. It needed patience. And New Year gave it both. What finally stopped it wasn't intervention, it was collapse. One night, the lights didn't turn on. For the first time since New Year, the house stayed dark. No arrivals, no departures, just silence. 2 days later, the house was empty. Not abandoned, cleared, furniture gone, curtains removed, no trash left behind, as if it had never been used at all. Authorities later struggled to classify what happened because crimes require victims, and victims need to identify themselves. Most didn't. Some couldn't. Some didn't want to. The case never made headlines. No raid footage, no dramatic arrests, just a quiet warning passed between departments about private services, about New Year vulnerability, about crimes that look like help. That's what makes this story dangerous. Not what happened inside that house, but how easily it could happen again, because somewhere right now, someone is promising relief, privacy, a reset, and someone else is listening. When the house went dark, people expected relief. They didn't get it. At first, neighbors felt something close to peace. No more late-night arrivals, no more shadows behind curtains, no more unexplained movement after midnight. The street looked normal again. That's when the damage became visible. People started talking, quietly, indirectly. Not about the house, about themselves. Someone mentioned losing time. Another talked about panic attacks that started after New Year. A third described waking up disoriented, unable to explain why certain memories felt edited. No one used the word crime. They used words like confusing, intense, emotional, life-changing. That's how cruelty hides. It changes the language first. A few people admitted they had gone inside, not to authorities, to friends, to partners, to therapists, always with the same explanation: I thought it was help. What they described wasn't violence, it was pressure wrapped in care. Sessions designed to wear people down without raising alarms. Isolation disguised as privacy. Control disguised as choice.
People were encouraged to share things they had never said out loud, then encouraged to reinterpret them, then encouraged to surrender responsibility for them. The most disturbing detail? No one remembered being told they couldn't leave. They remembered being convinced that leaving would mean failure. Authorities struggled to act. Consent forms existed, signatures were real. Nothing illegal was obvious. That's the point. The system looks for force. This crime avoided it entirely.
By the time patterns were recognized, the organizers were gone. Not fleeing, concluding. Like a project that had run its course. The house never reopened. No for sale sign, no renovation. Just an empty structure that no one wanted to talk about. Eventually, someone bought it. They repainted, changed the locks. The street moved on, but the people didn't. Some never spoke about what happened. Others couldn't stop. Relationships ended. Jobs slipped. Confidence vanished. Not all at once. Slowly, quietly. This is the part that doesn't show up in reports. The long-term effect. When a crime doesn't take your body, it takes your sense of agency. New Year came again. Decorations went up. Fireworks returned. People counted down like nothing had changed. But some of them didn't celebrate. They stayed inside. They avoided crowds. They avoided moments that asked them to trust. And that's the real ending of this story. Not the house, not the crime, but the way it reprogrammed fear. Because now when those people hear phrases like fresh start, reset, private help, their bodies react before their minds do. New Year is supposed to be about beginnings, but sometimes it's about realizing how easily endings can be hidden. This crime didn't need darkness. It needed belief. Belief in privacy. Belief in authority. Belief that if something were wrong, it would feel wrong. And that belief, that if something were wrong, it would feel wrong, is what made everything possible.